here in the classroom, and we also have a pretty good crowd out in Zoom land, and that's wonderful. We're all excited to hear from Dr. Fred Johnson about Africa and the West. We're pretty used to hearing Dr. Johnson talk a lot about military history. Are we going to have any military history in the presentation today, do you think?
Slightly.
Slightly. Okay, so we'll go a little bit back to some military history. Well, the presentation, as you know, is Africa and the West, and there are 3 sessions. This is the first this morning. And I would like to read something to you, so make sure that I let you know everything that's going to be going on in the introduction. For most Americans, the continent of Africa remains a largely unknown entity, especially with regard to its economic and strategic importance for combating threats and as terrorism, climate change, and human migration. This course will examine the dynamics and legacy of the Afro-European connection, including the United States, with the goal of achieving stability and prosperity for all nations involved. Today's presentation is called A Partnership of Pain, which you've already seen back here on the screen. So our discussion today will focus on Afro-American engagement, the reality since the days of Greek and Roman civilization. So we're going way back in history, but the rise of modern Europe altered both continents and foreshadowed future difficulties. So these are some of the things that Dr. Johnson is going to engage us in today. And if you don't know much about Dr. Johnson, he has been on Hope's staff for quite a number of years and teaching mainly in the history department. And his specialties are military history, specifically the Civil War. And he also teaches African history, and his degrees have been taken at Bowie State College University in Maryland, and a master's and PhD at Kent State in Ohio. And I know you're eager to hear Dr. Johnson today, so I'd like to turn the program over to him. Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Kit, very much. Good morning, scholars of HASP. It's good to see you all again. Happy New Year to you. Thank you. You know, some of my students have found a way to take advantage of find some positive features of the pandemic. Usually it was, you know, before class, I would get an email about maybe 30 seconds before class. Dear Professor Johnson, I can't come to class today. I just discovered I have a stomach flu. Now they have a legitimate excuse with so much quarantining. But it's good to be able to talk to you all about this subject, which Kit pointed out, alluded to. I don't get very often to discuss this. I didn't necessarily go to grad school to have a specialty in Africa. I thought at the time that it would be better for me to be specializing in Latin America. But it turned out that the teacher who was teaching Latin America at Kent State was a jerk, so I switched to Africa. So for our Winter 22 program, as Kit pointed out, a session 1, a partnership of pain. You know, one of the first things that, the reason I said in that little summary about Africa, that we don't know much about it, you would be surprised, maybe you all wouldn't be surprised at how many people still refer to Africa as a country instead of a continent. And it doesn't get much more fundamental than that. If you can't get that right, you're probably getting a bunch of other stuff wrong about the continent as well. Africa has for years had a bad public relations problem, a bad image problem. Not necessarily because of the Africans, but because of, for so many years, what happened with Africa was that people outside of Africa were telling their story. There's an African proverb that says that as long as the hunter gets to tell the tale of the hunt, no one will know the side of the lion. So the hunter wins, so he tells about how much of a glorious hunter he is, and the lion just ends up being a rug someplace. In the 1980s, there arose a branch of study called Africology, where African scholars from the continent said, we are going to reclaim our story, we're going to reclaim our culture, we're going to reclaim our history. In other words, we're going to teach the history, We're going to tell it because we're not going to tell it through European eyes. And if you want to understand how much of an impact Europeans have had upon the continent of Africa, consider this. Consider that in Mozambique, the folks speak Portuguese. In Angola, one of the largest countries on earth, is Portuguese. In Mali and Mauritania, in Senegal, is French. In Ghana, is English. In Kenya, is English. In Tanzania, is English. In Somalia, there's spatterings of Italian and English. In Cameroon, for God's sake, it used to be German, French, and English. Cameroon today is split between Francophone Cameroon and Anglophone Cameroon. And because human beings are human beings, having nothing else to fight about, they fight about that in Cameroon. I mean, I did not really understand how much this language divide in Cameroon was so divisive until spending about a month there a number of years ago in the early 2000s. They really do not like each other when it comes to those language differences. But as I mentioned, the bad public relations that Africa's had to deal with has been because of European scholars, European anthropologists, European historians who are talking about Africa through European eyes. So of course, at the time they're talking about it, meaning the 18th, 19th century, the result was a story mired in disrepute and scandal. For example, take this publication in 1879 by Henry Morton Stanley. Take a look at the title, Through the Dark Continent. I remember growing up when watching cartoons, sometimes you see these cartoons, they would say deepest, darkest Africa. Then they had that music, you know, the jungle music, dun, 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 boom, boom, boom. You know, the only thing that was missing, you know, were the gorillas swinging from the trees. But you see here Stanley's account of his travels and adventures of recent perilous journey through Africa under the above title will be ready for publication in May. This is a picture of Stanley. You know, swap him out, put him in a Confederate uniform, had there been an American slave, it's sort of the same result, isn't it? Now, the thing that makes this even more tragic is that Henry M. Stanley was supposedly one of the more enlightened people talking about Africa. But we don't want to oversell that enlightened business, because after all, Thomas Jefferson was supposed to be one of our most intellectually astute founding fathers, and he was. But Thomas Jefferson also wrote the Notes on Virginia in 1787, where, I'm paraphrasing, he said that, this is Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, who in his Notes on Virginia essentially said that, talking about his Black slaves, said that they will stay up all night having fun and doing all kinds of things, having merriment, when they know good and well they had to get up the next day and go out and work. He's kind of puzzled about why that is. He says they desire after their women with more art and lust, as opposed to the more nuanced features of romance and love. Basically, this is a species of people barely above the animal kingdom. Now, in the book White Over Black, I cannot remember the name of the author's name, but the book White Over Black, that author said that probably one of the worst things that ever happened in the history of Africa was when European sailors, at the time we're talking about in the 13th, 14th century, first made contact in West Africa, that they happened to see Africans in West Africa who also lived in the proximity with chimpanzees or gorillas. Because these sailors, being very skilled seamen, obviously, but not the most educated or literate people, and sailors being suspicious and having a whole lot of suspicions and being superstitious anyway, and being given the time that it was, they set up and saw the men and the apes and called them man-apes. That association has not ended to the 21st century. I was telling my students in the slavery and race class just the other day that it wasn't long until after Barack Obama announced his run for presidency in 2007, that you could go on the internet just like that and see pictures of him, pieces of a monkey superimposed on his and Michelle's faces. So those associations persist down to this present day. This is a picture out of some history books that show what it was like under British imperialism. Imperialism in Africa was nothing more than a form of modified slavery. It was. And this is where, particularly when we get to section two, this is where this kind of ideology, this kind of fictionalizing is going to come back and really bite Europe where it hurts. Because during the colonial period, Africans are told by the French and the British, and definitely by the Belgians, that they are uncivilized, that they're heathens because they're not Christians, and that they're savages. That's the word that they use all the time. The same words that Europeans use on Native Americans in North America. But what happens is that during World War I, when African colonial troops go to Europe and see how Europeans fight in World War I and World War II, when they see that kind of mechanized savagery, when they see industrial savagery, their generation from World War I goes back to Africa, and then sometime in the 1950s, having memorized what they've seen, they begin an independence movement. In other words, they already knew that they weren't savages, but then they went to Europe and saw real savagery. During World War I and II, they were done. They were done. This is a picture from 1957. This woman, Anna Russell, I had never even heard of this woman, but she apparently was an English lady. She did a lot of songs. They used humor in her act. She was a very famous performer. And so this was a very popular album that was released in 1957. This is 1957. 1957. Let me put it in context for you, right? Because historians like to place ourselves in time. So 1957 is this. It's 2 years after Emmett Till has been murdered in Money, Mississippi. It's 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. It is 4 years after we have signed a ceasefire on the Korean Peninsula with the North Koreans and the Chinese. It's 1 year before the establishment of NASA. It's 12 years before we put men on the moon. It's 1 year after the Montgomery City bus boycott. It's 3 years after the French have been defeated at Dien Bien Phu, which opens the doorway for America to get involved in Vietnam. We're talking about the middle of the 20th century. This is not at the Battle of Thermopylae here. This is not a long, long time ago. And this is what we're getting. This is how Africa is being portrayed in the middle of the 20th century. Again, it's a deep, dark, dangerous place where there are wild savages running around who clearly, apparently still want to eat people, and cannibalism is more commonplace than not. So all the messages about Africans from 1500, roughly when the transatlantic slave trade started, up until the 20th century, and even up to very recent history, have been communicated, have been designed, have been told to cast Africa as a place of mystery, danger, where the primitive and the culture, the history, the society were primitive, folks are uncivilized, and of course, they're savage. A forbidden place with forbidden things, with forbidden people. Now, just take a listen to the music. I don't want to make any assumptions. How many of you all remember seeing the original film of King Kong? The original one. So you remember when King Kong comes on stage and they have the people dancing around, they're playing that jungle music, boom, 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 boom. Okay, that's clearly not it, but that's my best rendition. You see the same kind of music, this jungle music, jungle sounding music, what their approximation of it, whatever it must be, in this cartoon as well.
Oh, for goodness sakes!
I guess nobody's too home. I hope. Roll up. Slow, ladies, slow head. Hold up. Hold up. Good morning, ma'am, sir. Is the lady of the house to home? I have here a fine assortment of assorted useful, useless utensils. They are all designed to take the work out of housework. Yeah. We are giving away absolutely free for 25 cents each one
Okay, I didn't want to stop before then. Look, the messages in there, there's some, it's on, I'm even as I look at this today, I remember seeing this cartoon as a kid. And there are parts of it that are still fun. I still find parts of it funny, but there are also some embedded messages in there about how people behave and assumptions of people, the cannibalism, the laziness, the stupidity. And this might be innocuous from the American perspective, had it not been for the fact that those same kinds of assumptions and stereotypes about people have been projected before the cartoon. You follow me? So as a standalone, this is maybe just another innocuous piece of art. But when these perceptions of Black people being stupid, lazy, and just overgrown children already existed, this feeds into that narrative. That's where it becomes very poisonous. That's when it's not just a standalone context. In other words, that's when this is part of the overall context of the history that people were telling themselves about a group of people. So by itself, nothing. Within that stream of historical narrative, damaging in the extreme. Africa is a large continent. It is so big. When I have flown from either Chicago primarily from Chicago to Schiphol in the Netherlands, and then you get on a plane to fly from Schiphol to Nairobi. I can remember the first time going to Kenya that I looked up, I don't know why I woke up, but the pilot said, I woke up, the pilot was announcing we were flying over the Sahara Desert. I fell back asleep, and 2 hours later asked the flight attendant, are we still over the Sahara? She said, yes. 2 hours in a plane at 28,000 feet, flying at 600 miles an hour. 2 hours later, still over the Sahara Desert. Are you following me? That's a big continent. That's just the Sahara. There's 54 countries, maybe 55 countries on the African continent. Honestly, I'll tell you truthfully, I've always had a problem with the designation African American because of the 54 countries. What it does is it causes Black people to just be blocked into the entire continent. Africans distinguish themselves by the country that they come from. They're not continental inhabitants. They happen to be people from Senegal who are part of the African continent. So, but it is what it is now, so we have to live with that. Yeah, West Africa, one of the newest nations on earth is Sudan. If you look, Sudan right here. South Sudan was created a few years ago because the northern part of Sudan, generally speaking, is dominated by Arab-speaking people or people who are culturally Arabic or who identify with the Middle East. With the southern part of Sudan, Black Sudan is more Christian, more Black African, and they identify more, they look more toward the west. And it was believed a few years ago that when they created South Sudan, that there would be a problem, that it will be a solution for engaging in some creative political geography to stop a long-running civil war. It has done the exact opposite. If you look to the right, where you see Yemen and Somalia, that particular geographic feature is called the Horn of Africa, like a rhinoceros horn. Okay? If you look to the left, particularly where Nigeria is, Nigeria is next to the country of Benin. That's called the Gulf of Guinea. That's called the Bight of Benin. Right next to Nigeria, there's a country of Cameroon, which, as I mentioned to you all earlier, used to be divided between the German colonizer, the French colonizer, and the English colonizer. The Germans lost their bid in Cameroon because they lost World War I. Because they lost World War I, part of their punishment at Versailles was to lose all their colonies. Off the coast of Cameroon, about maybe a 50-minute plane ride, is the island of Malabo. Malabo is an oil producing facility. So there's a lot of oil rigs offshore of Cameroon. In between Cameroon and Nigeria, there's a place called the Oil Rivers. The Nigerians and the Cameroons, you all won't hear about this in the news because, well, the news doesn't report this kind of stuff. But every now and then, the Nigerians and the Cameroonians, they don't go to war, but they do argue about it. Sometimes there are tensions between those two countries because that's a very, very, very oil-rich producing region. Up until the early 2000s, Nigeria was the 5th largest oil exporter to the United States. Now, we have done a lot since then through fracking, and you all can feel about fracking however you feel about it. Some people, say it's environmentally dangerous, and people in Western Pennsylvania have a lot to say about that. But because of fracking and some other very creative engineering and civil engineering stuff, we have been able to reduce our dependency upon that oil. But Nigeria is still a big oil producer. And one wonders, if you're ever wondering, why can't Nigeria, given the fact it's oil wealth, do better for its people? Well, Nigeria is also listed every year by the United Nations as being one of the most corrupt nations on earth. Africa has many parts. There's a whole continent. There's Mediterranean Africa. So again, to touch upon what Kit was talking about, what she alluded to in the introduction, Africa and Europe, their relationship did not start with the transatlantic slave trade. That begins right around the late 1400s, the late 15th century, when a Portuguese sailor named Anton Gonçalves makes the journey from Portugal, which is not all that unusual, given that Portugal is a coastal nation. They're going to use ships primarily and fast. And if you look at Spain and Morocco, yes, it really is possible to look across the Straits of Gibraltar and see Spain from Morocco on a clear day. I remember sitting at a restaurant in a place called Hercules Cave on the side of a mountain. It was a restaurant that somehow they had dug a hole inside of this mountain and put a restaurant there. And it was a very clear day. And I literally looked across the Strait of Gibraltar and saw Spain. You can see from this Mediterranean map that the African-European relationship easily goes back to the time of the Romans. The Mediterranean is one of the smaller bodies of water on earth. So Africa and the Europeans, the Greeks and the Romans traded with Africa. The Romans fought 3 different wars called the Punic Wars along the northern coast of Libya. And in fact, it was from this region of Libya, modern day Libya, that the African leader named Hannibal invaded Spain, rather Italy, and caused the Romans quite a great scare. Now, what this meant, because there was Mediterranean trade with Southern Europe in the Greek and Roman civilizations, with the nations of Africa and Egypt, Roman history is tied up very much with Egypt, with Cleopatra and Mark Antony and people like that. The Romans, they invaded North Africa, but because of that trade with the Greeks, the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, what that meant then was that a lot of trade from Africa was on a north-south orientation, from Central Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa or Black Africa to the Mediterranean, across the Mediterranean Ocean. So if it's across the Mediterranean Ocean, that meant that African people had to be seagoing as well. If you're going to have trade and barter, what that means then, if you're going to have trade and barter, Just like with the early Christian world, Paul was able to speak Latin and Greek. He was multilingual, right? Likewise, these African traders, because they are traders, and believe me, if you have never had an opportunity, if you've never done this, you've never had to take an opportunity to go to an African country, particularly on market day, you will find some of the greatest natural capitalists on earth. People, African people on market day, they will barter, they will haggle, they know how to make their money. That trade is on a north-south orientation because of the empires in Europe. It's not until West Europeans land to West Africa and the slave trade begins that north-south orientation will become east-west. And as it is, across the continent, meaning from East Africa to West Africa, there's a group of people called the Nyamwezi. This is Central Africa. If you look at Central Africa, let's take it roughly from Kenya in the east to Cameroon in the west. The Nyamwezi were a group of people who specialized in trans or cross-continental trading. So they had trading posts in the east and also in the west. My professor at Kent State, Dr. Ikichi, said that one of the greatest of their traders was a man named Mirambo, the Ntimi of Urambo, who had his location in the west. You see Central Africa here. This is Sub-Saharan Africa, what they call Black Africa. In the northern part, the reason why I want to show you this is because this continent is so diverse. Algeria, Libya, and Egypt identify more with the Middle East. They're Arabic-speaking countries, and they practice the religion of Islam. So although they are literally on the African continent, they are closely more aligned with the Middle East and Middle Eastern culture and Middle Eastern values and viewpoints. Same thing with Morocco, except that Morocco, being in the northwestern part of the continent, has more of a European feel to it. If you go from Tangier is more Moroccan, if you want to put it like that. Casablanca, less so. In Morocco, you have a group of people called the Berbers from the Atlas Mountains. On the African continent itself, there are at least 2,000 languages that are spoken and innumerable dialects. In Kenya itself, the dominant national language among the people, among the Kikuyu especially, is Kiswahili. But even in Nairobi, Kiswahili, there's a slang called Shang, S-H-A-N-G, that's spoken among the young people of Nairobi. So you know how, what in the 1960s, people would say groovy, man, groovy. Then today they go like, I feel you, it means the same thing. Language changes over time. Likewise, in Kiswahili, young people speak to each other in a different kind of way. What a wonderful thing to see, Kenyan parents walking around scratching their heads, wondering, what are you talking about? Like American parents do. Then East Africa. The Africans, they have divided their continent. For them, East Africa comprises not the entire northeastern quarter of the continent. For them, the East African community consists essentially of 3 countries: Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Now, we'll come back to Uganda because a lot of this stuff explains some of the difficulties Africa has today. Because of what's been going on in Somalia for a number of years, Somalia has been a failed state for a long, long time. Somalia has troubles right now. Somalia, along the Somali-Kenyan border, is caused some destabilizing influences in Kenya. In Uganda, for a long, long time, there was a group of people called the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, led by a woman named Alice Lakwana, who believed that Jesus Christ told her to come back and sweep the country of just happened to be all the tribes that she was not related to. Basically, she's using God to wage her war. And down in Tanzania, I remember Tanzania because I went there in 2004 to Arusha, Tanzania. Arusha is called the Switzerland of Africa. People go there for negotiations, for peace treaties, for all kind of high-level talks and whatnot. When I went to Arusha in 2004, it was to attend the IRC, the International Tribunal for looking into the Rwandan genocide of 1994. The IRC, the International Commission, to look into that, to try and catch the perpetrators, have been given 10 years to track down the people who are responsible for the 1994 Rwanda genocide. It was 2004, the last year. The day that we went to visit the courthouse, where they were still having the proceedings, there was a guy named Mika Muimana who was on trial. Now, because of the Rwandan genocide being as awful and horrific as it was, the woman who was testifying that day, you couldn't see her. We were in a visitor section that was glassed off, walled off, where you could see through the glass. The woman herself was in the witness box, but the witness box was about this big, and there were heavy green curtains from the ceiling to the floor all the way around it. But we heard the prosecutor asking her a question. She's out there, so we saw him. She's in here, we can't see her. She speaks French. The only French word I know is croissant. Now, I don't know what she was saying, but I heard her voice. This woman, whoever she was, and Mika Muimana was Mika Muimana, the defendant sitting over here. And I tell you what, he looks like he's a small man, diminutive, looks like a friendly grocer is what he looked like. The prosecutor's asking her questions, and this woman, her voice was so tense and trembling, you could still tell that she was frightened out of her mind. It's 10 years later. And the prosecutor then told us later on, Mika Muimana was one of the small fish. He was responsible for the death of only 10,000 people, they said. I said, he's a small fish. I didn't bother to ask what the big fish were responsible for. The people that committed the Rwandan genocide, they literally slipped across the border into refugee camps, the Democratic Republic of Congo, set up fiefdoms, and just waited out the IRC. It's worth taking a look at this because this is the Indian Ocean. And you'll see again, the Horn of Africa, where Somalia is, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, East Africa. But off the coast of Kenya and Mozambique, you see the island of Madagascar. That's also Africa. Also in the Indian Ocean, there's an island there called Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is an island where the inhabitants either have been removed or their lives have been taken over by the US government, one or the other. I haven't been able to nail it down actually. But Diego Garcia is a place where the American government has pre-positioned military supplies and equipment so that in the event of deployment to the Middle East, instead of having to lug all that stuff with us, you stop at Diego Garcia, pick it up there, then move it into the Straits of Hormuz or the Persian Gulf, wherever you need to go. So there's a lot of geostrategic thinking about this. When people have failed to look at Africa and its geostrategic significance, particularly when it comes to international terrorism and our physical national defense, that's a blind spot that we have, and it's unfortunate. If you look at the position of Africa with it relative to Saudi Arabia and Iran, the Straits of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea, it's not a question of can we, it's a question of how can we not afford to be in this area. Moving along, South Africa, which for so long had the terrible reputation of apartheid, state-imposed racism. Now, say what you want about the United States and its racial difficulties, and there have been many, and you could write treatises on America and its tortured racial history. But South Africa went one step farther by actually having it be state sanctioned and state codified. Now, also in South Africa, although South Africa itself is a country, you have Mozambique, Botswana, and Namibia. Namibia and Botswana are relatively new countries. They gained their independence post-1950. Just like Angola became independent, I believe, in 1980 or 1988. And then you have West Africa. West Africa is its own region with Nigeria. Nigeria in recent years has had some problems with Boko Haram, an ISIS wannabe terrorist organization. Niger is being destabilized right now because of a military coup that took place just a few days ago in Burkina Faso. In Liberia, right here, this is where former free Black Americans or former slaves were sent back here in the 19th century as a result of the American Colonization Society. Because at the time, and I kid you not when I say this, at the time, The people who were humanitarians of the ACS, they said the 19th century view in America was this: listen, we don't want you here and you don't want to be here. And since you're here, you're never going to get a fair shot. You're never going to be able to fulfill your potential. So we're going to give you a break. We're going to send you back to Africa. But I wasn't born there. It's been 3 centuries since we came from there. Too bad. We're sending you back. And the good news is this: you can carry the word of God with you and Christianize the heathens. So there were a lot of missionary organizations that were behind this as well. The American Colonization Society was established in 1816, and it continued up at least until the start of the Civil War. Look, Liberia today, its capital is Monrovia, named after the 5th American president, James Monroe. Its flag is red, white, and blue. There's a blue field with a single star, patterned after the United States. Instead of 50 stars, 1 star for the nation. Liberia was and has been an American outpost, although the United States has had a very ambivalent relationship with it for a long, long time. But Liberia was essential for America during World War II, particularly with the invasion of Southern Europe, Operation Torch 1942, as a way station where American planes would fly across the Atlantic, land there, refuel, then move north into Southern Europe. Again, the Gulf of Guinea, the Bade-Menu, you see right there, the rivers between Cameroon on the right and Nigeria on the left. Nigeria is the most populous nation on the African continent. The 2 economic powerhouses on the continent are Nigeria in the north and South Africa in the south. If you look at a map of ancient Africa, I really debated on how much to get into this. You know, ancient Africa, it's just so amazing. I wish we just had more time, more sessions on this bit. There were great empires in Africa all over the place. The kingdom of Kush that preceded Egypt, the kingdom of the Songhai people, the kingdom of Ghana, the travels of Mansa Musa. You see in the upper left-hand corner, there's Songhai, the Ghanaian Empire, the Mali Empire, the kingdom of Ife, and the kingdom of Benin, the kingdom of the Congo, and then the Bakongo. In the East Africa, there was a kingdom, you don't see it there. It was the kingdom of Buganda, not Uganda. But the ancient kingdom of Buganda, it had the unique feature where the royal lineage, but the Bugandans had kings, but the kings were chosen through the matrilineal line. In other words, the mother's line was the one that chose the king, not the father's. So there are a lot of kingdoms on the African continent where women were the ones who got to choose who will be the royal heirs. This map, I'll show you this map because when we see next week when we get together, the map that I'm going to show you of what Africa looked like by 1900 is so starkly different than this. Clearly, they had lost their ability to be independent. Let's keep moving. Time magazine asked a question once. Well, there was a question for this website. Do you think that the media gives people negative thoughts about Africa? One respondent said it most certainly does. The media only shows the poor parts of Africa. We're not all of Africa is like that. Of course, these places need help, but what about the poor in their own countries? How come they never show them or try to give any clarity to them, any charity to them? Lots of places in Africa are actually very wealthy, such as Nigeria. Have you seen Lagos? The media makes Africa look like a poor, depressed, and AIDS-ridden place that needs Western help. Not all of Africa is like that. The media makes Africa seem like a country when it is a continent. No wonder many immigrant people, as you ask if you speak African. It's like asking someone if they speak Asian or European. We need the media to show the great features of Africa so more people will want to go there and not think it is infested with AIDS, overgrown by jungles, animals on the loose, and lack of clean water. On the African continent, there are many religions that are practiced. Two of the dominant religions are Islam and Christianity. Now, from what I understand of this, my education tells me there are three great religions of the book. Judaism, where people, if you're a good practicing Jew, you must be able to read the Talmud and the Torah, okay? When it comes to the Quran, well, if you're a good practicing Muslim, it's helpful for you to be able to read the Quran. As a Christian, particularly after 1517 with the Protestant Reformation, it was a requirement to be a good Christian, you had to be able to read the Bible, which means then that if these Africans, to fulfill the calling of their faith, were going to be good Muslims, it means that by the time of the slave trade beginning, the people who were being enslaved were literate. They were not only literate, they could read Arabic. Are you following what I'm saying? People were being dragged to the bottom of slave ships who were literate, who had gone to school, who were part of bureaucracies, who are part of all the stuff that human beings do, good and bad. This map shows how Islam spread to Africa, different parts of Africa during different centuries. By the 8th century, Islam was definitely on the move across West Africa, then eventually further down into sub-Saharan Africa. Let me take a few moments to do this. You get the picture. Islam was spreading very rapidly across the African continent. And even where Islam wasn't being practiced, my professor at Kent State, Dr. Ikichi, was from Southern Nigeria. He said that among very strong among West African peoples, there's an understanding, there's still a cosmic view of life where many West African people, not Christian, not Muslim, they believe in a sky god though called Arochukwu. Okay, Arochukwu, who has his helpers, so he is the senior god, then there are lesser gods. Some people in Christianity call that the heavenly council, right? But there's the Trinity, and then there's a heavenly council, let us make God in our image, that kind of thing. So when you see it like that, the West Africans, even without Christianity, without Islam, they still have an understanding that there's a senior being up there calling the shots. And then there are lesser gods, and they believe in ancestral, not worship, but ancestral veneration. Ancestral veneration, that is, the people that came before them are standing around them right now. If I were to explain it this way, my ancestors are standing here with me right now, looking over my shoulder, rooting for me, pulling for me, clearing the way for me. They don't deserve worship, but they deserve to be revered for paving the way for me and living their own lives. This is my mentor at Kent State, Dr. Leonie Hudson. Dr. Hudson announced to me last year, he said, I'm retiring. I said, don't tell me about that. When I was in his class, Dr. Hudson said, he set me back on my heels one day when he said this: with regard to the transatlantic slave trade, not every Black man was a victim and not every white man was a villain. I said, please do explain. So he did. Consider this guy, Intera Duke. Bear with me as I read. Very little is known about Intera Duke, a slave trading chief from the Efik people who lived in Old Calabar, which is in modern day Nigeria. We know that he was literate and numerate, both speaking and writing in English, that he kept a diary in Pidgin English. Most of the diary has not survived, but the pages relating to 1785 to 1788 were copied and provide an extremely valuable primary source, which reflects the slave trade that went on within Africa. It goes on to say, Duke's diary charts a double life. He was both a leading member of his community and a slave trader. The Efik enslaved criminals from their own people, purchased people from neighboring towns and villages, and went on expeditions to capture people to enslave. The slave ship captains, mostly from Liverpool in this region, will collect small groups of captives from each trader. In return, the traders received imported Western goods such as iron bars, knives, guns, gunpowder, beads, and cloth. And let me just stop for a second. Guns were a major factor that tipped the scales of power, the balance of power among African peoples. Look, only people who do not fight with other people are people who are not of the human species. Africans had their enemies and their allies among tribes and tribal differences, and they warred against each other, just like the French went to war against the English. And the Italians went to war with their enemies, and the Germans went to war with the Germans went to war with the French, and so on. African people waged war against each other. When guns were introduced, that warfare, there was all those old antagonisms, gave one group of people the ability to more effectively dominate another group of people. And usually what happened on the African continent was that in those wars, the losers then were sold into slavery. So here's the bottom line. I cannot be standing here talking to you unless some relative of mine in some distant place was either sold into slavery intentionally, could not pay off a debt and became a slave, or was captured on a slave raiding expedition. The reason why I tell my students all the time that we got to tell the truth about this stuff is because if you don't tell the truth about how this occurred, then what happens is that Africa ends up looking like this weak continent where Europeans showed up, and just because on the basis of their whiteness, they showed up and Africans their knees started knocking, and the people just gave up all their citizens and let the Europeans take them away. That was not how that happened. The Africans were absolutely in charge of the Ashanti Kingdom, in Oyo, and Benin, especially those coastal African kingdoms. They were as powerful as any European kingdom that ever existed, either under Charlemagne, under Queen Victoria, any of them, or Queen Elizabeth, any of them. So Europeans landed on the coast, but to go into the interior, they had to get permission from the African kingdoms. Usually then what that meant then was that Africans had to go into the interior, get people and bring them to the coast, then sell them. Now in that case, the reason why Black people don't want that part being told because it makes Africans look bad, selling their own folk, right? Because it becomes a lot harder to blame, the complete blame for that on the Europeans. But then as we'll see, people go, well, you know, the African kings didn't know what was going on across the horizon on the western side of the Atlantic. That's kind of beside the point. This is the way the trade was conducted. Now this woman right here, Dr. Akosua Peribi, she said that for centuries along the West African coast, millions of Africans were sold into slavery and shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas. The middlemen were European slave traders based in forts like Ghana's Cape Coast Castle, now a tourist attraction and a somber reminder of a brutal crime against humanity. Now, the castle she's talking about was once owned by the Portuguese. Remember I said the Portuguese were there first, and it was called Elmina. Elmina translated to mean the mine. The mine, literally a mine where people, human beings were the product, not gold, not coal, human beings. That crime is usually blamed entirely on the European outsiders who inflicted slavery on African victims. But new research by some African scholars supports a different view that Africans should share the blame for slavery. It was the Africans themselves who were enslaving their fellow Africans, sending them to the coast to be shipped outside. European slave traders, almost without exception, did not themselves capture the slaves. They bought them from other Africans, usually kings or chiefs or wealthy merchants. So why did the Africans sell their own people? Good question. For 1,000 years before Europeans arrived in Africa, slaves were commonly sold and taken by caravans north across the Sahara. So there had already been a thriving slave trade in Africa, primarily done by the Arabs on that north-south trade orientation I was telling you all about. But then when Europeans landed in West Africa, that trade orientation stopped being from east to north to south, and it shifted from east to west across the continent. Why? Because whatever they were trading across the Sahara, quite frankly, it simply was not as valuable as that human or that black gold that they were putting in the bottom of those ships. I cannot explain to you how absolutely profitable the transatlantic slave trade was. Now think about this. You simply just have to go and take a look at a sailing ship of the 17th or even the 16th century to see how small these vessels were. These are not large ships. So the fact that you can get somewhere between 11 and 15 million people across the Atlantic Ocean on ships that small, even after 300 years, that's a lot of trips. That's a lot of people. That's what trying to, I don't know what do you do. That's why you stuff 5 people to a Volkswagen. 1960s Volkswagen, they're bigger now. Slavery existed in Africa. So people go like, well, why are the Africans doing this? Slavery was a part of African culture for many, many years, but slavery has existed everywhere. Slavery existed among Native Americans in North America. Slavery existed in China. Slavery existed in Europe. The word slave comes from the word Slav, meaning Eastern Europe. So everywhere where there's been human beings walking on earth, human beings have enslaved their fellow human beings. That's why we still are dealing with human trafficking today. If you have some free time, take some time and go to the US State Department. Every year, the State Department puts out a human trafficking report to see what nations around the world are exporting nations, which ones are destination nations. The United States rates every year that I've looked at it, we are a destination nation for people being brought here to be trafficked in slavery, primarily sexual slavery, meaning it falls hardest on young girls and women. So the raiders come, these people out here on a regular day on just at market day, they see them, the alarm, the terror. Some people decide to fight back. But as I mentioned to you all, it was the introduction of firearms that made the difference. Bows and arrows and spears could not stand up to gunpowder. And this is a picture of Elmina, the mine on the coast of Ghana, the interior of the fort. And as he pointed out, today it's a tourist attraction. President Obama went here early in his administration. You'll see here, you see those cannon there? At the time in the 15th, 16th century, it made forts. There's a book by Russell Weigley entitled The American Way of War. And for a long, long time, defense policy for the United States was where America would build coastal fortifications like this one, because in the days of wooden sailing ships, it made sense to have stationary points like this, because a sailing ship, in order for it to do damage to you, because the range on the cannon on a ship wasn't that far, it would have to get close to you. And then it was slow moving too. So even though the fort can't go anywhere, it's got as much of a chance of blowing the ship out the water, a better chance than the ship has of doing damage to the fort. So this arrangement made perfect sense. Plus, this is a very, very big fort. So these cannon are essentially long-range artillery. It's just to go from here to there. Any ship on the coast getting close is gonna have a problem, because just like with today's artillerymen, they can shoot around and get a marking round, adjust fire, and then lay in on it. So this was a very, very, very active place. I read accounts that African slaves sometimes could spend as little as 5 days here. Sometimes they could be here for 5 years. It just depended. To be held in a slave pen. Usually what happened, if in fact Africans went to the interior and raided a neighbor or went to war with an enemy, the prisoners were put into something called a coffle. A coffle, sometimes it will be chains, sometimes it will be pieces of wood that will be fashioned to be tied around people's necks like this, and they will be marched to the coast. Now, I'm sure some of you all have read the account of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano, he estimated that it took him almost 6 months to get from where he was captured to the coast of Africa. Equiano eventually made his way to America or to England and eventually got his freedom. And this is what they call the door of no return. It's in Dakar, Senegal, another slave departure point. People were put into the hold of the ship. Where the conditions were, to say the least, unpleasant. And look, here's what we have to remember. This is before there are any kind of cures or understanding things like cholera, dysentery, any waterborne disease, anything that's communicable disease in the warm, fetid hold of the slave ship. Many of these people have never even seen it. If they're like Olaudah Equiano, you've seen rivers, so water is not unusual to you, obviously. But to see the Atlantic Ocean, that could be a shock. Believe me, the first time, my first Michigan winter was a shock to me. So if you're not used to these kind of things, it's just very disorienting. It's fetid, it's warm, and plus, I really should have done this. Sometimes what I do with my students is I'll print out copies of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or some part of the New Testament. And I have these two rows read the part from the New Testament. Then I have these two rows read the Constitution. Then I have these two rows read General Douglas MacArthur's farewell address to West Point in 1962. Then these two rows read something different. And when everybody's reading it all, the different documents, it sounds like just a big jumble of words. No one can understand anything. Then I say, get louder. Then they read louder. Those are African people in the hold of the slave ship who are speaking different languages. They can't understand each other. They're chained together, laying side by side on their back or on their sides, because this is not an accidental trade. How do we know this? Because they took the time to actually draw a diagram so they can figure out how to get the most people aboard those ships. Now imagine this. Imagine laying beside somebody, you can't speak their language. And that hold is filled with fear and sweat and desperation. And you can't even look over to the person next to you and say, who are these people and where are we going? Listen, the college has done a wonderful job these days on getting the faculty up to speed on, we have a lot of students with emotional, challenges that need help, and they can be triggered. A lot of words I didn't know before. They're coming from different things, different families. I got that. Now that's in this environment on a college campus. It's well supported like Hope. Can you imagine the emotional traumas going on this slave ship? That, by the way, is going to last for years. And sometimes when they ran out of food, they simply threw people overboard. That's why I called it a partnership of pain, you all, with the Africans and the Europeans. And look, make no mistake about it. Those African chiefs who were selling their fellow Africans in slavery, they profited well. They were paid well. And those coastal kingdoms became richer and richer and richer and more powerful. But here's the problem. When trading in human beings becomes the basis of your economy, when that becomes the thing that you have to sell, what happens when that market dries up, if it ever dries up? Let's get there. I put this up here so you can see that the greater number of slaves are Africans reduced to slavery coming across the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade. They went to South America, especially Brazil. North America and the Caribbean, and frankly, North America got a trickle compared to the number of people who went to Brazil. This is why, by the way, when there were slave rebellions in the Caribbean and Brazil, look, the slave rebellions in Brazil, they weren't like these, these flare-ups that happened in North America, in the United States. Like, as bad as Nat Turner's rebellion was, it lasted for what, just a few days? 50, 60 people, men, women, and children, that's horrible. But in Brazil, slave rebellions lasted sometimes for years, and they involved thousands of people. In Haiti, the entire island was turned on its head, led by Toussaint Louverture, until Haiti eventually got its own independence, becoming the first independent Black republic in the Western world. So they estimate 0.5 million to the United States, 3 million to Europe, and there was still a thriving trade going to Europe as well. The transatlantic slave trade grew at a time when many African states were at war with each other, taking prisoners that could easily be sold to traders in exchange for guns. Is the gun, which was a deciding factor in the slave trade, introduced by Europe. But while Africans may have sold their own people into slavery, researchers say the kings and chiefs had no idea of the brutality of slavery on the other side of the ocean. If they had, they say, maybe the slave trade across the Atlantic would never have grown so huge or lasted for so many years. Given the human capacity for greed and exploitation, I seriously doubt that. Consequences of the trade. We need to understand that this is happening. Africa is selling off its youngest, strongest, most intelligent, most capable for 300 years. Men and women, but mostly men, because the people on this side of the Atlantic, they wanted men to do their hard work, where primarily first on sugar plantations, because growing sugar was a labor-intensive activity. Listen, Europeans, once they found out, the only people who would really get sweeteners for their food or their drinks at one point were the very wealthy in Europe. They had to use honey or some other kind of substitute. But once people found sugar and everybody could have it, once Europeans developed a taste for sugar, it was a taste that could not be quenched. The only people who won were the dentists. One of the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, when you take people, look, you can think they're illiterate. I've established for you that many of them were not. They were at least reading the Quran, which means that they were A, multilingual, and that they could read their language and read Arabic as well. But however you may think of them, that's the dichotomy. Is what you think, then there's who they are. Who they are people who know that. I don't know who you are. I don't know where I'm going, but I know that what you're doing to me right now is inhuman. And so if they decide to mutiny, and it did happen. I've always had a problem, quite frankly. I was trying to find a word last night to use instead of mutiny, because I don't think that people who have been reduced to slavery like this on a ship, you can't mutiny. A mutiny is if you're part of a crew, right? So this is an extra-legal, whatever is going on here, legal, extra-legal, it's not a mutiny. It's a rebellion for sure. In the meantime, while this trade is going on, in the meantime, something was happening back in England. In 1750, historians say that right around the year 1750, 1760, England started going through something called an industrial revolution. In other words, human beings stopped relying so much on human labor and animals to make what they wanted to do, and it began to shift toward machines. Now, if you're in some place like North America, and particularly after 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, the end of the French and Indian War, where you still have an agricultural economy, that's not the case in England. England has gone through several revolutions. They got a constitutional monarchy. They have shifted toward a mercantilist economy, which means it's pre-capitalism, but it's getting there. So the entire English economic system, social system, political system has allowed for a group of people that European historians refer to as men of talent, people who have good ideas and inventive entrepreneurial spirit to start innovating and inventing things and causing a revolution of industry. The reliance upon animals and human beings begins to move away in England. And England, an island nation, leads the way on this. France will follow, then Prussia, then eventually Russia, but definitely England in 1750. And because the British, 57 years later, see less and less of a need for slaves, by 1800, 50 years into their industrial revolution, after we've had our revolution from 1775 to 1783 with the peace treaty, then the Constitution's adoption in 1787. By 1800, in America, the state of Virginia, all by itself, I kid you not when I say this, Virginia, all by itself, will have a population, something that is unusual in modern history, in that America has a slave population that is not just large, it's reproducing itself. And we need to remember that Virginia in 1800 goes from the East Coast all the way to the Ohio River. There's no such thing as West Virginia. So take West Virginia, add that to Virginia, you've got one of the biggest states in the Union at that point. And so in 1800, Virginia has enough slaves and enough slaves who are reproducing to where Virginia becomes a domestic exporter of human beings throughout the entire rest of the South. All by itself. My home state. Now, in 1807, the British pull a fast one on the entire world. The British decide we don't need slavery anymore, so they declare the transatlantic slave trade illegitimate trade. And they begin patrolling the African coast with their navy. But what does that mean for us? Because it did mean something for us, you know. The issue of slavery almost caused the Constitutional Convention to collapse several times. Students sometimes ask, well, weren't any of the founding fathers against it? Some of them were. And every time they tried to broach the subject, Southern slaveholders at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia threatened to walk. You know what? Either make room for this or out of here. We need to also remember that at the Constitutional Convention, they went there to establish a government, not to get rid of slavery. It was not an abolitionist convention. It was there to establish a government. If they could get rid of it, they would have. That wasn't their charter. They were on thin ice as it was because they only went there to review the Articles of Confederation. When they decided to draft a whole new document, they were really playing with fire. Well, since they drafted their new document, since they made allowances for, since they had to compromise, Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution read as follows. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. The British outlawed the trade the year before. For what this means is that in 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, when the issue of slavery came up, still here. When the issue of slavery came up, they tried. They didn't know what to do about it. The nation was already so dependent upon it. It was, as Thomas Jefferson would later say in 1820, in the aftermath of the Missouri Compromise crisis, already then, like Jefferson said, it was a nation we had a wolf by the ears. We can neither hold him safely nor let him go. And as I say all the time, it would have been one thing if Thomas Jefferson said, we can't hold him, but he qualified it. He said, we can't hold him safely, nor can we let him go. We're between the rock and the hard place, the catch-22. Use whatever metaphor you want. By 1787, we were already so dependent upon race-based African slavery that the country found itself in a quandary. It painted itself into a corner. So not knowing what to do, they did the next best thing. They said, at some point, this thing can't last. The world's changing. England is changing. So we'll give ourselves a 20-year window to figure out what to do about it. From 1787 to 1808. 1808 came and passed. Because by 1808, the English Industrial Revolution, which was driven by the textile sector, by 1808, America was producing cotton that the British wanted. It was the best cotton produced in the world. And it was grown by Black slaves. There was absolutely no way America was going to get rid of that industry because the Americans had the Southerners had this good problem. They had a raw material that the British couldn't get enough of. They couldn't keep up with it. So Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1. And I need to first understand this. This is before the Constitution even is adopted and ratified as law of the land. So before the first Constitutional Congress convenes, they're telling what the Congress can't do. You can't touch this thing called slavery until the year 1808. But a tax or duty may impose on such importations not exceeding $10 for each person. This effectively made the US government a participant in the transatlantic slave trade. Now what? Now what does America do? Well, they put us at odds with the British. There were American slave smugglers that were intercepted by the British. Most of the time, they were just told to offload the people wherever they were. There were 5,000 African Americans, 5,000 Black Americans who fought for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, or many Black people fought for the British Of course, the British lost that war, so black folks, many of them, as they could, fled to Nova Scotia. And then at some point, a British warship came along, picked them up, and dropped them off in West Africa at a place called Sierra Leone, they call it today. So the British Navy patrolled the West African coast. Moved to the 19th century. And by the time you get to the later 19th century, after the War of 1812, but particularly after the American Civil War, and specifically after 1850. In 1850, things begin to happen in Europe, particularly when you start having the what I call Industrial Revolution 2.0. The first Industrial Revolution ended, the second one began, and it needed even more raw materials. And Africa became a different kind of place because those Europeans needed not just those raw materials, but the prestige of having colonies, but also now wasn't just the British. The person you see in the film right there, the person you see in the picture right there, that is a picture drawn to honor Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, who was called the greatest of the European colonizers, certainly the greatest of the British colonizers. When I say greatest, I mean the one who was most exploitative. Next week, we'll talk about Cecil Rhodes wasn't there when Europe's chickens came home to roost. Thank you. I can take a few minutes for questions, and I got to go see my dentist. What do you have? Yes, sir.
Can you say something about missionaries and their impact on the colonial policy?
Can I say something about missionaries and their impact upon colonial policy? Missionaries, okay, first of all, missionaries do a good job. Many of them go there with very good intentions, go to Africa and other places around the world with good intentions, and they actually do take the Bible and the Word of God to very many people. However, I've talked to enough Africans and African scholars, they say that there's a saying on the continent that says, when the Europeans came, they had the Bible and we had the land. When it was over with, they had the land and we had the Bible. So there are very many missionary organizations, and I even saw one survey that said, you know, some of the benefits of colonialism. I said, I'm gonna have to go back and look at that. So very often, sometimes colonial policy, imperial policy, which is more exploitative and more oppressive, would have been antithetical to what the missionaries were trying to do. But here's the problem, and this is one of the things that, for those of you that are interested in this kind of discussion, there's an African missionary scholar named Lamin Sanneh, Lamin Sanneh, who said that one of the problems, I'll call it a problem, or let's say it's a challenge. One of the challenges of missionaries was that people who are the goodness of their heart, they really want to bring the Word of God to people, but then they say, in order for you to do this, you first have to learn my language. Now, Lamin Sanneh says, no, if you want people to actually do this, you teach them the Bible. How about translating it into Kiswahili, letting them learn it through their cultural mirror, instead of having them learn your language, because language is the first step of disappropriation of a people's culture. Now, if you read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, that's one of the things that happens with the missionaries. They force people into missionary schools, teach them English. Once they learn English, then people start thinking that they're better than their neighbors who aren't speaking English. Then it causes divisions in communities and so on and so forth. So it's a very complicated but long-term process, but a good question. Thank you. Next.
Given that these European countries colonized other nations around the world, how come slavery was dominant in Africa as opposed to Asia or South America or any other geographic area?
Gary, do you mean slavery as in Europeans enslaving people, or the people enslaving their own people?
Well, when I think of, say, for example, China or India or the Philippines, or you had French that basically became a colony in Vietnam, how come those residents didn't become slaves but the African nation people did become slaves.
If I'm understanding you correctly, let me put it to you like this. There was slavery, again, every group of people on earth, they've enslaved each other. That's the first thing, okay? Europeans enslaved each other, Africans enslaved each other, we've established that. So why didn't the Europeans enslave the Vietnamese, what they did Africans? Colonialism was the Africans have said, and people who have been colonized, they said that colonization was a form of slavery. When we talk next week about particularly what happened in the Belgian Congo, I'm gonna tell you the truth. Listen, colonization was a generally horrible enterprise, but of all the horrible people that practiced it, King Leopold II of Belgium was the worst. He's the one that started the practice of chopping off people's hands if they weren't producing enough rubber. So they disappropriate people's, they force people into labor, they don't pay them, they destroy families, they give corporal punishment willy-nilly for the slightest infraction, they rob you of everything. That's why the colonized, wherever they were, called it enslavement. So same thing happening, two different words, it all washes out into the same river. Does that help? Next. Or let me not be so stern. Next. Nope.
Thanks, Fred. Another great presentation. I'm curious to know what your take is on the 1619 project. Maybe we should explain. I don't know if everybody here knows what it is.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, it was introduced by the New York Times about 2.5 years ago on the 400th anniversary of the landing of the first slave ship in North America. And among other things, it contends that the real founding of the United States of America took place then.
At Jamestown,
Not
right,
on July 4th, 1776.
right.
Another thing is that it contends that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. And now it's been introduced in schools as curriculum. What is your feeling about that?
Okay, well, I think that the 1619 project, Milt, was begun because so much of that history was left out of the textbooks and not being told. And it's saying, I think that the people now where there might be, where there's definitely a bifurcation. Some people say like, what do you mean American history starts at 1619 as opposed to 1775 with the American Revolution? And was the American Revolution really fought to preserve slavery as opposed to get independence from Great Britain? How about this? As human beings and educated critical thinkers, we're supposed to be able to entertain two thoughts at once. On the one hand, the revolution was fought definitely to gain independence, but in the process of doing so, it made room for a system of slavery. So what happens already, the Americans got this duality of personality. We're fighting for independence and freedom. That's why the founding fathers had to be very careful when they use words like freedom and liberty, particularly slave-owning founding fathers, because Black slaves were smart enough to know that if they're talking about independence and freedom for themselves, maybe they mean me too. They didn't mean that. So this turned out to be a problem. So I think that what happened, the controversy with the 1619 project was that people wanted to change the start of American history to 1619 as opposed to 1776. I think you can have both and still have a reasonable civil discussion about both of them. Let me put it to you all like this. On the first day of my class, Slavery and Race in America, I'm teaching this semester, I asked the students, how many of you have heard of George Wallace? Nobody. How many of you have heard of Bull Connor? Nobody. I said, how many of you have heard of Jefferson Davis? Everybody raise their hands. I said, so let me get this straight. You ever heard of Ida B. Wells, a Black woman that waged a one-woman campaign against lynching? But you have heard of Jefferson Davis, a guy who led a section of the country in a 4-year war against the Constitution and committed treason. You've heard of him. And I said to them, I said, now, look, this is for you to answer. Because this is a commentary upon your education. How is it that Jefferson Davis, who defied the Constitution and committed treason and led his nation in a 4-year war against the United States government, how can you know, how is it that whoever decided your curriculum said it's more important for you as an American citizen to know that than Ida B. Wells, who fought against lynching? Or the woman who preceded Rosa Parks and not giving her seat up on the bus, or E.D. Nixon, or Ella Baker, all these people. They had not heard, they hadn't heard of the Little Rock Nine. They heard something about Emmett Till, and I said, now look, given what we've been going through for the last 2-3 years, can we really have a functioning democracy where people, and look, I said, I don't need you to love Black people, but what I need you to do is be able to understand the American story, because the story, though, it's not only the story that we have, but the story we choose to tell ourselves explains who we think we are. That's why people keep on getting surprised when people protest in the streets. In 2021, when people were celebrating, or not celebrating, but memorializing the Tulsa race riot of 1921, I got more calls to talk about doing that. I said, I will not do Tulsa, but I can also talk about East St. Louis, 1917, Rosewood, 1923, and Chicago, 1919, because Tulsa was just one incident of many. So I think it's possible to have the 1619 Project. It needs to be discussed, as well as the American Revolution. There's more I can say about that. Thank you for that good question, Milt. All right, do we have another one?
I do not currently have anything on chat, so with that,
You guys are wonderful. Thank you for actually staying awake, unlike my cast of characters this afternoon will do. My dentist awaits. Thank you.
thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Go ahead, Kit.
Thank you. We'll welcome you back again for session 2 of Africa in the West. Take care.